Hey guys, how's it going? Hope you're doing well. My name is Crown, and today I'm going to read you some very interesting stories that I hope that you're gonna love. And now, without further ado, let's go!
We're a small office of about 15 people, and we all share one break room with one coffee machine. Coffee is serious business in our office. We're all running on deadlines, client calls, and way too many meetings. That coffee machine is basically our lifeline. It's not fancy, just a standard drip coffee maker, but it keeps us functioning. There's this unspoken rule that everyone knows about. If you take the last cup of coffee, you make the next pot. It's simple office etiquette. Common courtesy. Most people follow it without question because we all understand that we're in this caffeine dependency together. But there's one person who just doesn't get it. Or maybe she gets it and just doesn't care. Let's call her Karen. Karen works in accounting. She's been here longer than me, maybe 5 years. She's one of those people who think seniority gives her special privileges. She parks in the best spot, takes the longest lunch breaks, and somehow always manages to dump her extra work on the newer employees. The coffee thing started about 6 months ago. I began noticing a pattern. Every morning around 9:30, Karen would stroll into the break room with her oversized mug. She'd pour herself coffee, and more often than not, she'd drain the pot completely. Then she'd just walk away, leaving the empty pot sitting there like it was someone else's problem. At first, I thought maybe she just forgot. We all have busy mornings, right? But then it kept happening. Day after day, week after week. Karen would take the last cup and vanish back to her desk. The rest of us would find the empty pot, and someone would sigh and make a fresh one. Usually it was me or one of the other, younger employees. The senior staff would just shake their heads and move on with their day. I tried talking to her about it once, caught her right after she'd done it again. I mentioned that she might have taken the last cup there. She acted like she didn't notice and told me she didn't realize. When I suggested she could start a new pot next time, she told me she was really swamped and was sure someone would get to it. Then she just walked away like making coffee was beneath her or something. This went on for months. Every single morning, Karen would drain the pot and disappear. The rest of us would find the empty machine and someone would reluctantly make more coffee. It was getting ridiculous. I started paying closer attention to her routine. Karen was methodical about it. She'd wait until the pot was almost empty, then swoop in and pour the last cup. Sometimes she'd even check the pot first, see there was only a little left, and come back later to claim it. She knew exactly what she was doing. The breaking point came on a busy Monday. We had a huge presentation due for a major client, and everyone was stressed. I've been at the office since 7 in the morning, running on maybe 4 hours of sleep. I went to get my second cup of coffee around 10 and sure enough, found an empty pot. Karen was sitting at her desk sipping from her full mug, looking completely unbothered. That's when I decided enough was enough. I started watching her more carefully, timing her coffee runs. She was predictable. Every morning between 9:30 and 10, she'd make her move. She'd hover near the break room, wait for the pot to get low, then strike. So I waited for my moment. Tuesday morning, I positioned myself where I could see the break room. Karen made her usual approach around 9:45. I watched her check the pot, see it was nearly empty, and wait a few minutes for someone else to take a cup first. Then she moved in, poured the last cup, filling her mug to the brim. She even scraped the bottom of the pot to get every last drop. She said something about perfect timing to herself, and I could tell she was proud of her strategy. I waited until she was completely out of sight. Then I made my move. I walked into the break room, looked around to make sure no one was watching, and unplugged the coffee machine. Just pulled the cord right out of the wall. Then I walked back to my desk and waited. About 20 minutes later, I heard someone in the break room expressing confusion about what was wrong with the machine. Another voice joined in, wondering if it was broken. The first person explained that it was unplugged and the pot was empty. Word spread quickly. People started gathering in the break room, trying to figure out what happened. Someone plugged the machine back in, but of course, there was no coffee to heat up. Our manager showed up and asked who had the last cup. The room went quiet. Everyone looked around at each other. One co-worker mentioned seeing Karen with coffee earlier. Another confirmed they'd seen her drinking some when they walked by her desk. The manager called Karen over to explain what happened. I could see Karen from my desk. She looked panicked. She tried to play dumb at first, claiming she didn't know what happened and that the machine was working fine when she used it. When the manager asked if she took the last cup, Karen admitted she might have, but told him she didn't really pay attention to how much was left. A coworker pointed out that the pot was completely empty and the machine had been unplugged. The manager told her someone needed to make coffee because people were waiting. Karen protested that she was really busy with month-end reports. The manager told her that if she took the last cup, she needed to make the next pot because that was the rule. The whole break room was watching now. Karen couldn't back down without looking even worse. She reluctantly agreed but complained that she didn't know why this was such a big deal. She had to make a fresh pot while everyone stood around waiting. I could see her getting more flustered when people kept coming in asking when the coffee would be ready. Karen asked how long the machine took and someone told her about 5 minutes, adding that she'd know if she ever made it before. That comment got a few chuckles. Karen looked embarrassed. When the coffee was finally ready, I got up and poured myself a cup. It was perfect. I walked past Karen's desk on my way back and thanked her for making the coffee, telling her it was really good. She just said whatever and didn't make eye contact. Karen must have realized that people were watching her coffee habits now. For the next few days, she was careful to leave some in the pot. But old habits die hard. Within a week, she was back to her old tricks. Except now every time she took the last cup, someone would immediately call her out on it. Co-workers would point out that she'd emptied the pot again. She'd claim she barely took any, and they'd ask why it was empty then. She'd have to walk back to the break room and make more coffee while people waited and watched. It happened 3 times that week. By the end of the month, Karen had learned to leave at least half a cup in the pot. She'd rather drink less coffee than deal with the public shame of being caught taking the last drop. She never figured out what happened that first day. She never knew I unplugged the machine. She just thought it was some random malfunction that happened to expose her bad habit at the worst possible moment. Sometimes I catch her looking at the coffee machine suspiciously, like she doesn't trust it anymore. But she follows the rule now. Every morning I watch her check the pot level before pouring, making sure to leave plenty for the next person. I still haven't told a word about what I did, but every time I pour my morning coffee from a pot that isn't empty, I smile a little. I moved in with my roommate about 8 months ago when I started my new job downtown. The rent was decent, the place was clean, and he seemed normal enough during our brief meeting. What I didn't know was that I was about to live with someone who had zero respect for other people's property. The first few weeks went smoothly. We kept to ourselves mostly, split the utilities fairly, and maintained our own spaces. I'm pretty particular about my food since I'm lactose intolerant, so I stick to plant-based alternatives for most things. Oat milk became my go-to for coffee, cereal, and smoothies. It's not cheap, about $5 a carton, but it's worth it to avoid spending my morning doubled over in pain. That's when the problem started. I buy a fresh carton of oat milk on Sunday during my weekly grocery run. By Wednesday, it would be nearly empty. At first, I thought maybe I was using more than I realized, but when I started paying closer attention, I noticed the level dropping way faster than it should have been. My roommate had a habit of making elaborate breakfast smoothies every morning before work. I'd hear the blender going while I was getting ready. One day, I caught a glimpse of him in the kitchen and noticed he was pouring something white and creamy into his blender. My something white and creamy. I decided to test my theory. That weekend, I bought a new carton and made a mental note of exactly how much I used each day. By Tuesday morning, nearly half of it was gone and I had only used maybe a quarter. I confronted him about it while we were both in the kitchen that evening. I asked him directly if he'd been using my oat milk. He immediately denied it, claiming he didn't touch my stuff. When I explained that I bought it 3 days ago and it was almost half empty, despite me barely using any, he suggested that maybe I was using more than I thought. I pointed out that it cost $5 a carton and I was the only one who drank it. His response was ridiculous. He said maybe it was evaporating or something. Evaporating? Right? I dropped it there because arguing wasn't going to get me anywhere, but I knew he was lying through his teeth. The next week, same thing happened. I tried moving the carton to the back of the fridge, thinking maybe if it was out of sight, he'd leave it alone. Nope, still disappeared at the same rate. I even tried putting a sticky note on it that said, "Please don't use, lactose intolerant." The note stayed put, but the milk kept vanishing. When I asked him about it again, he got defensive and asked why I was accusing him since he'd already told me he didn't use my milk. I asked him where it was going since we were the only two people who lived here. He sarcastically suggested that maybe I was sleepwalking and drinking it, and when I told him to be serious, he insisted he was being serious and told me to stop blaming him for my problems. That's when I knew I needed to get creative. This guy was not only stealing my food, but lying straight to my face about it. If he wanted to play games, I could play games too. I went to the store and bought two things: a fresh carton of oat milk for myself, which I immediately hid in my bedroom mini fridge, and another carton that I took home for my special project. I carefully opened the second carton and poured out all the milk. Then I got to work creating my masterpiece. I mixed mayonnaise with warm water until it reached the right consistency. The color was close but not quite right, so I added a tiny splash of vanilla extract to get that slightly off-white oat milk color. For the final touch, I added just a splash of white vinegar to give it that slightly tangy taste that oat milk has. The mixture looked identical to real oat milk, same color, same thickness, even smelled sort of right if you weren't paying close attention. I poured my creation into the empty carton, sealed it back up, and placed it right in the front of the fridge where he couldn't miss it. Then I waited. The next morning I was in my room getting dressed when I heard the familiar sound of the blender starting up. Perfect. A few minutes later I heard what I've been waiting for. A loud sipping sound followed immediately by the most disgusting gagging noise I'd ever heard. Then came the spitting and coughing, followed by the slam of the refrigerator door. He shouted from the kitchen, demanding to know what the hell was wrong with the milk. I walked out to the kitchen, trying my best to look confused and innocent, and asked what was wrong. He complained that the milk tasted like garbage and was completely spoiled. I offered to check it myself. I opened the carton and took a small sip, making sure to barely let it touch my lips, then told him it tasted fine to me and suggested maybe he got a bad batch in his smoothie. He insisted the milk was definitely bad and asked when I'd bought it. I told him yesterday, so it should be fresh. I watched the wheels turn in his head. He couldn't admit that he'd been using my milk without also admitting that he'd been lying to me for weeks. He was trapped by his own deception. Finally, he stammered that maybe he'd grabbed the wrong thing from the fridge that morning, claiming he was still half asleep and all. I asked him directly if he was admitting to using my milk. The silence stretched between us. He realized what he'd just admitted. He backpedaled, saying it was just this once because he was out of regular milk and running late. I asked him about all the other times over the past month. He apologized and promised to buy me a new carton. I made him promise he'd stop using my food without asking, and he agreed. But I wasn't quite done yet. Over the next few days, I noticed he kept eyeing that carton of fake milk suspiciously, probably wondering if it had actually gone bad or if something else was going on. He never touched it again, and it sat in the fridge for a full week before I finally threw it out. True to his word, he bought me a replacement carton of real oat milk, and more importantly, he never touched my food again. In fact, he became almost overly careful about making sure he didn't accidentally use anything that belonged to me. He started taste testing his regular milk for the next few weeks, taking tiny cautious sips before adding it to his smoothies. I guess once you've had a mouthful of mayo water, you never quite trust your beverages the same way again. 5 years ago, my son was diagnosed with muscular dystrophy. He was only 8 years old when the doctors told us he'd need a wheelchair for the rest of his life. It was devastating news for our family, but my son handled it better than any of us adults did. My kid is obsessed with superheroes. Always has been since he could walk. When we found out about the wheelchair, the first thing he asked wasn't about his condition or what it meant for his future. He asked if he could get a superhero wheelchair. I'll never forget the look on his face when he said it. Pure excitement mixed with hope. So that's exactly what we did. We worked with a custom wheelchair company and designed the most amazing superhero-themed wheelchair you've ever seen. It had Batman's logo on the back, Spider-Man's web pattern on the wheels, and Superman's colors throughout the frame. The armrests had little Captain America shields, and there were LED lights that could change colors. It cost us a fortune, but seeing my son's face light up every time he sat in it was priceless. The wheelchair became his identity in the best way possible. Other kids at school thought it was the coolest thing ever. He went from being the kid who couldn't walk to being the kid with the awesome superhero chair. It gave him confidence and made him feel special instead of different. Last Saturday, we decided to take a trip to the mall. My son had been asking to go to the comic book store there for weeks, and I figured it would be a nice family outing. We were walking through the main corridor when I noticed this woman staring at us. Well, specifically at my son's wheelchair. She had this kid with her, maybe 6 or 7 years old, who immediately started pointing at the wheelchair and getting excited. I didn't think much of it at first. Kids always react that way when they see my son's chair. Usually the parents smile politely and we move on with our day, but this woman started walking toward us with purpose. I could tell something was off by the look on her face. She had that entitled expression that I've learned to recognize over the years. She approached me and asked where I got the wheelchair. I told her we had it custom made and explained that it was medical equipment. She then told me that her son loved superheroes and had been asking for something like this for months. I was confused by where this conversation was going. I suggested that there were lots of superhero toys at the toy store upstairs if she was interested. She shook her head and said, I didn't understand. She explained that her son wanted to try the wheelchair, just for a few minutes. I stared at her. I told her that this wasn't a toy but my son's mobility device that he needed to get around. That's when her entitled attitude really came out. She argued that my kid could walk for a few minutes because she'd seen kids in wheelchairs stand up before. She claimed her son had been good all day and deserved a turn. I felt my blood pressure rising. My son was sitting right there, listening to this woman talk about him like he wasn't even present. I told her that my son could not walk and that the wheelchair was not a toy. I made it clear that no one else was going to use it. She called me ridiculous and selfish, insisting it was just a wheelchair. Her kids started tugging on her shirt, whining about wanting to ride the cool chair. Instead of explaining to her child why that wasn't appropriate, she decided to take matters into her own hands. Before I could react, this woman reached down and grabbed my son under his arms. She literally lifted him out of his wheelchair and dropped him onto the floor of the mall. My 13-year-old son, who weighs maybe 90 pounds and has a muscle condition, was suddenly sitting on the cold tile floor looking up at me in shock and confusion. She stood there and announced that now my son could sit there for a minute while hers tried the chair. I was frozen in horror for about 2 seconds. My son was on the ground, this woman's kid was climbing into his wheelchair, and she was standing there like she'd just solved some simple problem. But before I could even move or say anything, I heard a voice behind me. A mall security officer ordered the woman to step away from the child and put her hands where he could see them. I turned around to see the officer who had witnessed the entire thing. He'd been doing his rounds and saw this woman assault my son. She tried to explain that there had been a misunderstanding and that she was just letting her son try the wheelchair. The officer wasn't buying it. He told her that she had just physically removed a disabled child from his mobility device and thrown him on the ground. He ordered her to turn around and put her hands behind her back. She protested, calling the situation insane and claiming she didn't throw anyone. She insisted the kid was fine. The officer wasn't having any of it. He grabbed her arm and spun her around, then began reading her rights. She screamed that he couldn't arrest her because she was a mother, and her son was right there. The officer explained that he had witnessed her assault a minor and that she was under arrest. He pushed her face down onto the ground right there in the middle of the mall and cuffed her. People were stopping to stare as she struggled and yelled about how unfair everything was. She ranted about police brutality and demanded to speak to his supervisor. She even had the nerve to complain that the wheelchair was too fancy and question why a kid needed something like that. The officer called for backup while she continued her meltdown on the floor. Her own son had climbed out of the wheelchair and was crying, asking why mommy was being arrested. I quickly helped my son back into his chair and checked to make sure he wasn't hurt. He was shaken up but physically okay. The officer told me he would need me to stick around to give a statement. He also mentioned they would need to take photos of my son for evidence, just in case she tried to claim he wasn't actually disabled. I agreed to cooperate with whatever they needed. She was still yelling when they led her away in handcuffs. She blamed me for everything, insisting I should have just let her son have a turn. She threatened to sue all of us. Child services ended up getting called for her kid, and her husband had to come pick him up from the mall. The officer told me later that she was charged with assault on a minor and could face serious jail time. My son handled it like a champ. On the way home, he told me the wheelchair worked exactly like it was supposed to. It helped him get around and made the bad guy get caught. 2 weeks later, we got a call from the prosecutor's office. The woman had tried to plea bargain, claiming she thought my son was faking his disability for attention. When they showed her the medical records and the officer's testimony, she finally accepted a plea deal that included anger management classes and community service at a children's hospital. She also had to pay for any therapy my son needed and cover the cost of having his wheelchair professionally cleaned and inspected for damage. The company I work at has several development teams, and I was assigned to a team of 6 developers. I'm the only woman on my team, but that's pretty normal in tech. Most of my co-workers are great. We joke around, help each other out with code problems, and generally have a good working relationship. I've always been easy to work with. Several people have told me they enjoy having me on the team, which made me feel like I was fitting in well. But there's this one guy on my team. He's been at the company for over 10 years, so he has seniority over me. At first, I thought he was just passionate about his work. You know how some developers can get particular about coding practices and system design. I respected that. But over the months, I started noticing a pattern. This guy would have explosive outbursts whenever someone didn't do exactly what he wanted. He'd get angry if you solved the coding problem in a way that didn't match his preferred approach. He would micromanage everyone's work, even though he wasn't anyone's boss or team lead. He just acted like he owned every project. He'd talk down to people. If you asked a question he thought was stupid, he'd make you feel like an idiot. If you made a mistake, he'd go on long rants about proper procedures. Everyone just seemed to accept it as normal behavior. Nobody ever stood up to him. I tried to stay professional and not let it bother me. I figured I was the new person, so maybe I just needed to prove myself. But his behavior was getting worse, especially toward me. He'd hover over my desk, questioning every line of code I wrote. He'd interrupt me during meetings to correct things I said. It felt like he was constantly looking for reasons to show that I didn't belong there. Which brings me to today's incident. I was working on updating some software components based on a new technical document. The document contained descriptions of how certain parts of our code base were supposed to work, and some of these descriptions had been recently revised. My job was to rewrite sections of code to match the new specifications. The problem was the descriptions in the document were unclear. There were technical terms that could be interpreted multiple ways, and some of the implementation details were vague. I've learned that when you're not sure about requirements, it's always better to ask for clarification upfront rather than guess and waste time building the wrong thing. So I decided to email the engineer who had written the document. This guy is really knowledgeable about our system design. He's written a lot of the core architecture, and he's always been helpful when I've had questions before. I figured a quick email asking for clarification would save everyone time and prevent mistakes. I opened up my email and started typing a simple message asking for clarification on what he meant by certain technical terms. Just a straightforward request for help understanding the requirements better. But before I could even finish typing, the problem coworker exploded. He started yelling at me across the office, saying that he knew these things and that I should ask him instead. He told me to stop bothering the expert who wrote the document. He was literally screaming about it. Everyone stopped what they were doing and stared. I was so shocked that I just sat there for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. The word bothering really got to me. I was sending a 2-sentence email asking for clarification on a document the expert had written. That's part of normal work communication. But this guy made it sound like I was spamming the expert with hundreds of pointless emails. I'm usually good at staying calm in confrontational situations. I've dealt with difficult people before, and I know that reacting emotionally usually makes things worse. But something about his tone and the way he was treating me like I was doing something wrong for just trying to do my job properly really pushed me over the edge. I turned around in my chair and looked directly at him. I asked him if he was my boss or something and explained that I was emailing the expert because I wanted his explanation since he was the one who wrote the document. He started getting even more worked up. He kept repeating that I was being rude and that my response was inappropriate. And that's when I lost my filter. I told him that if he thought I was being rude, then he could go cry about it. The entire office went dead silent. You could hear a pin drop. Everyone was staring at us like they were shocked by what had just happened. And honestly, I was shocked too. I'm not usually someone who talks back like that. But here's the thing, nobody ever stands up to this guy. For over a year I've watched him have these angry outbursts at different people, and everyone just takes it. They avoid eye contact, they don't respond, they just wait for it to blow over. Management doesn't seem to care or notice. It's like he has some kind of immunity because he's been there so long. This was the first time anyone had actually pushed back against his behavior, and you could tell he didn't know how to handle it. He just stood there sputtering for a few seconds, then walked back to his desk. The rest of the day was awkward. A couple of my co-workers came over later to quietly tell me they were glad someone finally said something to him. One person mentioned they'd been dealing with his outbursts for years and were impressed that I stood up for myself. But I could also tell that some people thought I had gone too far. I keep replaying the incident in my head, wondering if I handled it wrong. Part of me feels justified. His behavior was unprofessional, and I was just trying to do my job. I have every right to email whoever I need to in order to get the information required to complete my work. He's not my manager, and he has no authority to tell me who I can and can't communicate with. But another part of me wonders if I should have just ignored him like everyone else does. Maybe I escalated the situation unnecessarily. Maybe telling him to go cry about it was too harsh, even if he deserved it. After our confrontation, I did end up emailing the expert anyway. And guess what? He responded within an hour with helpful clarifications and thanked me for asking instead of making assumptions. It was exactly the kind of professional interaction that should happen when someone needs clarification on technical requirements. I haven't decided yet whether I'm going to report the incident to HR or just let it go. On one hand, his behavior has been a problem for a long time, and maybe it's time someone officially complained. On the other hand, I'm still relatively new, and I don't want to be seen as a troublemaker. What I do know is that I'm not going to let him intimidate me anymore. If he wants to have another outburst, he can deal with whatever happens next. I'm here to do good work, not to manage his emotions or walk on eggshells around his fragile ego. The office dynamics have shifted since our confrontation. He's been avoiding me, which honestly makes my workday much more pleasant. And I've noticed that he's been less aggressive with other people too. Maybe all he needed was someone to show him that his behavior isn't acceptable. Or maybe he's just planning his revenge. Either way, I'm ready for whatever comes next. I'm 39 now, but this happened when I was 29. I have multiple chronic illnesses that affect my mobility. Some people don't understand invisible disabilities because they expect everyone who needs handicapped parking to be in a wheelchair or using crutches all the time. That's not how it works for me. My conditions cause severe joint pain, muscle weakness, and fatigue that comes and goes unpredictably. On bad days, I can barely make it from my bed to the bathroom without my cane. On better days, I might be able to walk short distances without any aids, but I still need to conserve my energy and avoid overexerting myself. The handicapped parking permit isn't just for convenience, it's medical equipment. just like my cane or my medications. I've been having a particularly rough week with my symptoms, but that Tuesday morning I woke up feeling slightly better. My legs weren't screaming at me for once, and I could put weight on them without wincing. I still felt that underlying ache and weakness, but it was manageable. I decided to risk a quick trip to the grocery store since I was almost out of food and had been putting it off for days. I grabbed my handicapped parking permit from the glove compartment and hung it on my rearview mirror before pulling into one of the designated spots near the store entrance. I was grateful for the closer parking because even on my better days, long walks could trigger a flare-up that would leave me bedridden for days afterward. When I opened my car door and stepped out, I immediately heard a child's voice nearby. A boy who looked about 8 years old was asking his father why I was using the handicapped parking spot. They were maybe 20 feet away, having just gotten out of their own car in a regular parking spot. The father looked directly at me and made sure his voice carried across the parking lot when he answered his son. He loudly explained that some people steal their grandmother's handicapped parking permits and that it was really wrong to do so. He said it loud enough that other shoppers in the area could hear him clearly. I felt my face flush with a mixture of embarrassment and anger. This wasn't the first time someone had made assumptions about my disability, but it never got easier to deal with. I took a deep breath and walked over to them. The father's eyes widened slightly when I approached, probably not expecting me to confront him directly. I looked down at the little boy who seemed genuinely curious rather than malicious. I gently told the child that his dad was really wrong. I explained that I had a bunch of illnesses that made walking difficult for me some days, and that to keep my legs working, sometimes I needed to walk shorter distances. The boy nodded, looking confused but trying to understand. Then I shifted my gaze to his father, making direct eye contact. I told him that my grandma was actually dead and had been since I was about 4 years old. I added that some people just make assumptions, and that was really wrong. The father's face went through several different expressions: surprise, embarrassment, and then defensive anger. He grabbed his son's arm roughly and said they were leaving. He practically dragged the poor kid toward the store entrance, walking so fast they were almost jogging. I could see him looking back over his shoulder at me a couple of times, probably worried I might follow them or cause more of a scene. I just stood there for a moment, shaking slightly from the adrenaline. These confrontations always left me feeling drained, both physically and emotionally. But I was glad I'd said something instead of just letting it slide like I sometimes did. When I made my way toward the store, I noticed several other shoppers had witnessed the exchange. An elderly woman gave me a sympathetic smile and a small nod of support. A younger woman with a toddler in a shopping cart silently mouthed an apology when I passed by. Inside the store, I tried to focus on my shopping list, but I kept thinking about that little boy. He'd seemed genuinely curious about why I was using the handicapped spot, which was actually refreshing compared to adults who just made nasty assumptions. Kids usually just want to understand the world around them. About halfway through my shopping, I spotted the father and son in the cereal aisle. The dad saw me coming and quickly steered his cart in the opposite direction, clearly trying to avoid another encounter. I felt a little satisfied that he was the one feeling uncomfortable now. When I was checking out, the cashier was friendly and helpful, packing my bags carefully and asking if I needed help getting them to my car. I suspected she might have heard about what happened in the parking lot through the store gossip network, but I appreciated the kindness regardless. When I was loading my groceries into my car, I saw the father and son coming out of the store. The kid looked over at me and waved slightly before his dad quickly guided him away from my direction. At least the boy didn't seem to have absorbed his father's judgment and hostility. I drove home feeling emotionally exhausted but somewhat vindicated. And now we have reached the end of today's stories. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.